guy like you, I'm sure we'll find something if we look hard enough. Calloway! Start tossing the place! Let's find what he's hiding.
The sunlight of a Tuesday morning sliced through the blinds of apartment 3B, striping the polished hardwood floor in patterns of gold and shadow. It was 10:02 a.m. Marcus Thorne sat at his kitchen table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. A half-finished cup of black coffee sat beside his left hand. In his right, he held a well-worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. The stillness was a daily ritual, a conscious effort to build a perimeter of peace around himself after years spent in places where peace was a foreign concept. The apartment was immaculate, Spartan. Every object had its place, a testament to the discipline forged in the crucible of the United States Marine Corps. A framed photograph on the wall showed a younger Thorne in dress blues, his gaze steady, his posture rigid. It was a life he had left behind, but one whose lessons were etched into his very being. He was reading a passage about controlling one's perceptions when the peace was not just broken, but annihilated. It started with a sound that didn't belong, a heavy metallic thud against his front door. It was too solid for a knock, too deliberate for an accident. Thorne's head snapped up, his body instantly rigid. His senses, honed by 2 tours in Helmand Province, went on high alert. He placed the book face down on the table, his movements economical and silent. He was halfway to his feet when the second impact came. This one was a violent, splintering crack that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of his doorframe giving way. There was no announcement, no shout of "Police!" no warning. There was only the methodical application of overwhelming force. Outside in the hallway, Officer Brad Miller adjusted his grip on the battering ram. Sweat dripped down his temple, mingling with the grime of the city. He was 34 years old, with a wiry, restless energy that often tipped into aggression. His record was a patchwork of commendations for bravery and formal complaints for excessive force and racial profiling, a duality the department had chosen to manage rather than resolve. Today, he was high on the potent cocktail of adrenaline and certainty. An anonymous tip whispered of a stash house, of product moving through this very building. The informant had been vague on the unit number, 3rd floor, on the left. But Miller felt it in his gut. He knew. This was it. He didn't wait for backup to confirm. He didn't run the plates on the vehicles in the lot. He didn't waste time with a warrant. Warrants were for cowards. Action was for cops. He and his partner, a younger, more impressionable officer named Calloway, were the tip of the spear. Miller swung the ram a 3rd time. The impact was catastrophic. The deadbolt, the lock, and a sizable chunk of the doorframe ripped free. The door flew inward, crashing against the interior wall with a boom that echoed through the small apartment. Plaster dust snowed down onto the floor. Miller dropped the ram and drew his Glock 19 in one fluid, practiced motion. Calloway followed a half-second behind him, his own weapon held in a trembling, 2-handed grip. "Police, get on the ground! Hands where I can see them!" Miller bellowed, his voice raw with command. They stormed into the apartment, tactical boots pounding on the hardwood, their eyes scanning the room for threats, for the hardened criminals their minds had already convicted. Instead, they found Marcus Thorne. He was standing in the space between the kitchen and the living room, clad in a simple gray t-shirt and athletic shorts. He hadn't raised his hands. He hadn't dropped to the ground. He was perfectly still, his body a study in controlled tension. His hands were open at his sides, palms facing forward, a universal sign of non-aggression that was also the posture of a man ready to react. His expression wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was a cold, analytical focus. He was assessing them, their posture, their trigger discipline, the frantic energy coming off them in waves. In that split second, the power dynamic they had assumed was theirs began to subtly invert. They had breached the walls of his home, but they had entered his space, his territory. And Marcus Thorne was not a man who was easily intimidated in his own territory. The silence stretched for a heartbeat, thick and heavy, punctuated only by Miller's ragged breathing. The morning sun continued to stream through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, particles of a shattered peace. Officer Miller took a half-step forward, the muzzle of his Glock unwavering, centered on Marcus Thorne's chest. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the splintered wood and the metallic tang of adrenaline. "I said on the goddamn ground! Now!" Miller's voice was a serrated edge, designed to cut through resistance and compel obedience through sheer force of will. His partner, Calloway, flanked to the left, his weapon tracing a nervous arc as he scanned the rest of the small apartment. The living room was sparse. A couch, a coffee table, a television. No clutter, no paraphernalia, no sign of the drug den Miller had envisioned. The dissonance between his expectation and the reality before him only served to tighten the coil of aggression in his gut. But Marcus Thorne did not move. He met Miller's furious gaze with an unnerving calm that seemed to absorb the officer's rage rather than reflect it. His military training had conditioned him for moments like this, where panic was a fatal luxury. The first rule of engagement was to control your own response. Assess threat, identify the objective, and act with intention. The immediate threat was the man with the gun. The objective was survival and de-escalation. His intention was forming with crystalline clarity. He slightly angled his body, a subtle shift that presented a smaller target, but more importantly, put him in a direct line of sight with a nondescript black box mounted high on the wall near the ceiling, disguised as a smoke detector. "Lower your weapon, officer," Thorne said. His voice was not a plea, but a calm instruction. It was deep, steady, and carried an inherent authority that caught Miller off guard. "You are in my home without cause and without a warrant." The statement, delivered with such placid confidence, was like a spark on dry tinder. "You don't give me orders," Miller snarled, taking another step. "You are a suspect in a felony investigation. Now get on the floor before I put you there." He could feel Calloway's unease beside him. The younger officer was glancing between his partner's rigid posture and Thorne's composed demeanor, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Suspects were supposed to be scared, to be frantic, to give them a reason to use the force they were so ready to deploy. Thorne ignored the command. His eyes remained locked on Miller, but his right hand began to move, slowly and deliberately. He brought it up to his chest, fingers extended. "I am reaching for my phone on the table behind me," he announced, his voice a clear, even metronome. "It is my right to record this interaction." "Keep your hands where I can see them!" Miller shouted, his knuckles white on the grip of his pistol. Thorne paused his movement, his hand hovering in the air. He held Miller's gaze. It was a test of wills, a silent negotiation conducted over a potential chasm of violence. In that moment, Thorne made a calculated decision. The phone was a secondary objective. The primary system was already in place. With his hand still raised, he made a fist, then extended his index and middle finger, a quick, almost imperceptible gesture. Across the room, a tiny blue light on the disguised camera blinked once, then glowed solid. Simultaneously, an identical unit in the living room and one in the hallway activated. The system was live. A secure, encrypted stream was now being broadcast to a cloud server and simultaneously pushed as a live feed to a select group of contacts and, if triggered, to his public social media profiles. The eye of the storm was now open, and it was recording everything. Miller, blinded by his own rage, saw the gesture only as an act of defiance. He didn't see the tiny blue light. He didn't know that his image, his voice, his aggression, and his firearm pointed at an unarmed man were now being preserved as immutable data. He was so focused on dominating the man in front of him that he failed to notice the silent digital witness that had just been summoned. The room remained a tense tableau. 2 cops, 1 civilian, and a web of unseen technology capturing the unfolding violation. Thorne held his ground, a statue of composure, knowing that the most powerful weapon in the room was not the gun pointed at his chest, but the silent, unblinking lens that was now broadcasting the truth to the world. The solid blue light of the camera was a silent promise. Marcus Thorne slowly lowered his hand back to his side, the decision to leave the phone on the table a strategic one. A physical phone could be knocked away, smashed, confiscated. The integrated system was invisible, untouchable. It was the perfect observer. The stream was now active, the digital curtain raised on a stage Thorne had never intended to set. The initial alert went out to a small, curated list. His sister, a civil rights attorney in another state, his former platoon sergeant, now a private investigator, and a veterans advocacy group he volunteered with. For the first 30 seconds, the viewer count was 0. Then it flickered to 1, then 3. "You think you're a smart guy, huh?" Officer Miller sneered, misinterpreting Thorne's calculated stillness as arrogance. "Let's see how smart you are in the back of my cruiser." He gestured with his weapon toward the couch. "Sit! Over there! Hands on your head!" Thorne complied, moving with a fluid economy that was devoid of any hint of fear or submission. He sat on the edge of the couch, lacing his fingers behind his head as instructed. His position gave the living room camera a clear, unobstructed view of the entire scene. He was not just a victim. He was now the unwilling director of his own ordeal. Calloway, seeing Thorne comply, seemed to regain a sliver of confidence. He began a cursory search of the immediate area, opening a closet near the door, rummaging through the contents with unnecessary roughness. "Anything you want to tell us about?" he asked, his voice strained. "We got a tip about a major distributor operating out of this apartment. Heroin, fentanyl. Your day is about to get a whole lot worse, man." Thorne's eyes flickered from Calloway back to Miller, who remained fixated on him. "Your tip was wrong," Thorne stated simply. "Oh yeah? That's what they all say," Miller shot back, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "We'll be the judge of that once we tear this place apart." At that moment, Thorne's sister Maya was sitting in her office in Chicago, preparing for a deposition. The notification on her phone was jarring, a high-priority alert labeled Home Intrusion Protocol. Her heart leaped into her throat. She fumbled with the device, her fingers trembling as she clicked the link. The live feed filled her screen. She saw her brother, his back straight, hands on his head. She saw the wrecked door, and she saw the 2 armed officers, one menacing her brother, the other ransacking his belongings. The audio was crystal clear. She heard the accusation, "Heroin, fentanyl." A wave of cold fury washed over her. She immediately began a screen recording, a redundant but necessary precaution. Then she started typing, her fingers flying across her keyboard, sending the link to legal networks, civil liberties groups, and a handful of trusted journalists. The viewer count on Thorne's stream ticked past 50, then 100. A comment appeared on the live feed, visible only to the administrators on his contact list. "This is illegal. They have no warrant." Another followed. "Broadcasting this wider, everyone needs to see." Back in the apartment, Miller was growing more agitated by Thorne's stoicism. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. Thorne's calm was a denial of his power. "You live here alone?" Miller demanded. "Yes." "No girlfriend? No roommates?" "No." "So all the product we're about to find is yours and yours alone. Good to know. Makes the paperwork easier." Miller paced back and forth in front of Thorne, a caged predator. "You people move into a decent neighborhood and you think you can just bring the whole place down with your filth. We're here to stop that. We're the line." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was the moment the subtext became text. The viewer count surged past 500. The live chat, now being monitored by Thorne's former sergeant, was a cascade of angry messages. "Did he just say, 'you people'? This is a straight-up profiling case. Someone get the address, call their precinct, flood them." The unseen audience was no longer just watching. They were beginning to act. A digital swarm was coalescing, drawn to the blatant injustice unfolding in real time. They were witnesses, and their collective presence was creating a form of accountability that Miller, in his blind rage, could not yet comprehend. He thought he was in control of a room. He had no idea he was now the star of a show being broadcast to a rapidly growing and increasingly furious global audience. The stench of Miller's prejudice lingered, but Thorne refused to engage with it. Reacting to the slur would be a tactical error, shifting the focus from the officer's illegal actions to his own emotional response. He had to keep the encounter grounded in fact and law. The cameras were rolling, and the record had to be clean. "Officer," Thorne said, his voice cutting through Miller's monologue with surgical precision, "I'm going to ask you again. Do you have a warrant to search my home?" The question, so direct and legally potent, seemed to momentarily short-circuit Miller's aggression. He stopped pacing. "I don't need a warrant," he snapped, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "We have what's called exigent circumstances." Thorne's eyebrows raised slightly. It was the first sign of any emotion he had shown, and it was one of academic curiosity. "Exigent circumstances," he repeated, the question hanging in the air. "Please enlighten me. What is the immediate danger of evidence being destroyed? Who is the fleeing suspect you are in hot pursuit of? What life is in imminent danger inside this apartment?" He recited the legal standards from memory, his tone less like a suspect's and more like a law professor's quizzing a struggling student. The legal accuracy of Thorne's questions clearly unnerved Miller. Cops like him operated in a world of bluster and intimidation, where their authority was the only law that mattered. They rarely encountered someone who could so calmly and accurately quote the rule book back to them. "The tip," Miller said, falling back on his only justification. "The tip is our probable cause. It said drugs were being sold out of here right now." "An anonymous tip?" Thorne pressed. "Does that tip meet the standards of reliability established in Illinois versus Gates? Was it detailed enough to provide predictive information that you were able to corroborate before taking action? Did you conduct any surveillance? Did you attempt a controlled buy? Or did you simply take an unverified claim and use it as an excuse to kick down a door?" Each question was a blow, dismantling Miller's flimsy justification piece by piece. The name-dropping of case law was a calculated move, designed to signal that Thorne was not an ignorant civilian. Calloway, who had stopped his search to listen, looked visibly pale. He had graduated from the academy less than a year ago. He remembered these cases, the endless lectures on the Fourth Amendment. He knew they were on thin ice, and it was cracking beneath their feet. On the live stream, the viewer count had swelled into the low thousands. Maya was now on the phone with the local ACLU chapter, feeding them information as she watched. Thorne's platoon sergeant had identified Miller's precinct from the insignia on his uniform, which was visible in a high-resolution frame capture. The precinct's phone lines were beginning to light up with calls from angry viewers, demanding to know why officers were conducting a warrantless raid on a private citizen. The digital world was converging with the physical one. "You watch your mouth," Miller warned, his voice low and menacing. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. Legal arguments were not his strong suit. Force was. "We're the police. We decide what's probable cause." "That's where you're mistaken," Thorne replied, his voice still infuriatingly level. "A judge decides what constitutes probable cause. You are required to present evidence to a neutral magistrate to obtain a warrant. You have skipped that step. Everything you are doing right now, every drawer you open, every item you touch, is fruit of the poisonous tree. It is inadmissible. It is illegal." He then delivered the final critical blow to Miller's crumbling foundation. "And let's talk about that tip. What apartment number did it specify?" Miller hesitated. It was a detail he had bulldozed over in his rush to action. The informant had been hazy. "Third floor. Apartment on the left from the stairs," he recited, trying to sound confident. Thorne allowed a small, grim smile to touch his lips. "The stairs are at the other end of the hall, officer. My apartment, 3B, is on the right. The apartment on the left is 3A. It belongs to an elderly couple who have lived here for 20 years. He let the information sink in. You didn't just act on an uncorroborated tip. You acted on an uncorroborated tip and still managed to get the address wrong. The justification, already built on sand, was washed away by a tide of incompetence. Miller stood there, his weapon still pointed at Thorne, but its power was gone. The gun was no longer a symbol of authority. It was a monument to his catastrophic failure. And thousands of people were watching him realize it. The revelation that they were in the wrong apartment hung in the air, dense and suffocating. For Calloway, it was a moment of dawning horror. He looked from Thorne's steady gaze to the splintered door, then to his partner. He saw the truth in the tightening of Miller's jaw, the frantic darting of his eyes. But for Officer Miller, the exposure of his incompetence did not lead to retreat or remorse. It ignited a deeper, more volatile fuse. His authority had been challenged, his judgment proven wrong. All he had left was raw dominance, and for that, he reached into the darkest part of his psyche. The mask of professional procedure, already worn thin, crumbled away completely. What remained was pure, unfiltered bigotry. "Wrong apartment?" Miller scoffed, a desperate, ugly laugh escaping his lips. "Doesn't matter. A guy like you, I'm sure we'll find something if we look hard enough. You probably got warrants in 3 different states." He took a step closer to Thorne, invading his personal space, the muzzle of his Glock now just a few feet from Thorne's face. "Or maybe you're just the lookout. Where's your crew? You got them hiding in the walls?" Thorne remained silent, his expression a granite mask. He knew this turn. He had seen it in the eyes of men in war zones and in the sneers of men on the street. It was the desperate lashing out of someone who has lost control and resorts to the oldest, ugliest tool available: hate. His silence was his shield. He would not give Miller the satisfaction of a reaction. He would simply be the mirror, reflecting the officer's own ugliness back at him. On the live stream, the comment section erupted. The thinly veiled racism of "you people" had now become overt, undeniable hostility. Maya Thorne felt a cold dread mix with her rage. She was watching a man with a gun and a badge verbally abuse her brother, live, in his own home. The legal case was becoming stronger with every word Miller spoke, but the danger to Marcus was escalating in tandem. His calm was heroic, but she feared it would provoke the officer into doing something irreversible. Miller wasn't getting the fearful reaction he craved, and it drove him further into his rage. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted, leaning in closer. "You were so chatty a minute ago with all your fancy lawyer talk. You think knowing a few big words makes you better than me?" He gestured around the clean, orderly apartment with his free hand. "You think having a nice, clean place like this fools anyone? It's a front. It's always a front." He turned to Calloway, who was standing frozen near the doorway. "Calloway, start tossing the place. I want you to check under every cushion, inside every book. Let's find what he's hiding." Calloway hesitated. The order was a direct command to proceed with an illegal search, even after it was clear they had no legal standing. He looked at Thorne, then back at Miller. The internal conflict was plain on his young face, the ingrained obedience to a senior officer versus the dawning realization that he was party to a federal crime in the making. "Brad, maybe we should—" "Don't Brad me!" Miller spun on him, his fury redirecting for a second. "You do what I tell you to do. Are you a cop or not? Search the damn apartment." The overt racism, the admission of being in the wrong location, and the direct order to conduct an illegal search were all being broadcast to an audience that was now approaching 10,000. Viewers were recording the feed on their own devices, creating dozens of mirrors. Hashtags were starting to trend. Hashtag Justice for 3B. Hashtag Wrong Door Raid. Hashtag Officer Miller. The digital world was not just watching. It was creating an archive of evidence so massive and redundant that it could never be erased. Miller, in his desperate attempt to reassert his dominance over one man, was immolating his career in front of a global audience. He thought his badge gave him impunity, but every hateful word he spoke was forging the bars of his own cage. He had kicked in a door to find a crime, and in the end, the only criminal in apartment 3B was him. While Officer Miller's meltdown was consuming the oxygen in the apartment, the digital reaction was reaching a critical mass. The viewer count on Marcus Thorne's live stream was no longer climbing. It was exploding. 10,000 became 20, then 50, a geometric progression fueled by shares, retweets, and the algorithms that detect and amplify moments of intense online activity. The stream was being picked up by major activist accounts, civil rights organizations, and even a few celebrity influencers who recognized the viral potential of such a raw, unfiltered display of injustice. Thorne's former sergeant, David Chen, was now operating like a digital command and control center from his home office in San Diego. He had two monitors running. One displayed the live feed, while the other was a blur of activity. He was coordinating with Maya, feeding verified information to journalists who were now frantically messaging him. He posted the precinct number and the non-emergency line in a pinned comment on the stream. The effect was instantaneous. The 17th Precinct's switchboard, normally a sleepy hub of minor complaints and dispatch calls, was overwhelmed. Every line was lit. The dispatchers, confused and flustered, were inundated with calls from across the country, from New York, from Florida, from California, all describing the same unbelievable scene. One of their officers, Brad Miller, was holding an innocent man at gunpoint in the wrong apartment, live on the internet. The first few calls were dismissed as pranks. By the 50th, a sense of panic began to set in. A bewildered desk sergeant pulled up the social media site on his own computer, and his face went ashen. He saw the live feed. He saw the splintered door of 3B. He saw Officer Miller, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He saw Officer Calloway, looking lost and terrified. And he saw the viewer count tick past 80,000. He grabbed his radio, his voice cracking with urgency. "Dispatch, I need the shift supervisor at Thorne's address, now!" Advise responding units, this is a Code 3 situation, but it's a media event. The scene is being broadcast live. Back in apartment 3B, the outside world began to bleed in. Miller, still trying to intimidate Calloway into searching the room, was oblivious. But Thorne, whose senses were attuned to every subtle shift in his environment, heard it first. A distant, faint siren. Then another, closer this time. He knew the calls were working. The digital tide was beginning to crash against the shores of his physical reality. The live chat was a waterfall of information and outrage. "They're on the wrong floor and in the wrong apartment. He admitted it on camera. Someone needs to get Calloway out of there before Miller makes him an accomplice." Viewers were acting as a real-time jury, prosecutor, and news service all at once. They were dissecting Miller's every word, time-stamping his threats, and creating a crowdsourced dossier of his misconduct. They were no longer a passive audience. They were an active force, a digital militia demanding accountability. Miller finally registered the sirens. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "What the hell? Did you call for more backup?" he asked Calloway. Calloway shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, that wasn't me." The sirens were growing louder, converging on their location from multiple directions. It wasn't the sound of a routine response. It was the sound of a crisis in progress. Miller's bravado finally began to crack, replaced by a dawning, sickening understanding that something was terribly wrong. Something beyond the confines of the room he had violated. He had been so consumed with his one-man war against Marcus Thorne that he hadn't realized he had inadvertently declared war on the entire world. The digital tide had turned, and it was coming to drag him under. The unseen audience had made itself known, not with a voice, but with the overwhelming sound of approaching sirens. The first backup unit screeched to a halt in front of the apartment building, tires chirping on the asphalt. Two officers, O'Connell and Diaz, jumped out, their hands already on their holstered weapons. The call had been chaotic and confusing, something about an officer in distress, a hostage situation, and a live broadcast. They expected to find a gunfight, a barricaded suspect, a scene of violent turmoil. Instead, they saw a few residents peering nervously from their windows and a startling number of people on the sidewalk across the street, all staring at their phones. They bypassed the elevator and took the stairs two at a time, bursting into the third-floor hallway with guns drawn. The scene that greeted them was surreal. The door to 3B was a wreck, hanging crookedly on one hinge. Just inside, they could see Officer Calloway, his back against the wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. Further in, Officer Miller had his weapon trained on a black man sitting calmly on a couch. The man on the couch looked less like a dangerous felon and more like someone patiently waiting for a bus. There was no shouting, no struggle. The tension in the room was thick, but it was a strange, one-sided kind of tension, emanating entirely from Miller. "Brad, what the hell is going on?" O'Connell demanded, lowering his weapon slightly as he took in the bizarre scene. "Dispatch is screaming. The whole city is calling 911. Miller's head snapped toward them, his eyes wild. "It's under control," he barked. "I've got him. He's part of a major drug ring. Just help me secure him and toss this place." But O'Connell and Diaz didn't move. They were seasoned cops, and their instincts were blaring. Nothing about this situation fit the narrative Miller was trying to sell. The suspect wasn't resisting. The apartment was clean. And Calloway looked like a kid who had just watched his hero commit a terrible crime. Diaz's eyes scanned the room and noticed something Miller had missed. The small black dome on the wall, a tiny blue light glowing in its center. His heart sank. He'd seen setups like that before in high-tech homes. It was a camera. He unclipped his radio. "Dispatch, be advised we are on scene at apartment 3B. The situation is not as reported. Stand by." He deliberately kept his voice low and professional, aware that he might be on audio. The hesitation of his fellow officers was a visible blow to Miller. The blue line, that unspoken code of solidarity, was supposed to be absolute. They were supposed to fall in line, back his play, and help him clean up the mess, no questions asked. But O'Connell and Diaz weren't backing his play. They were standing in the doorway, their expressions a mixture of confusion and caution. They recognized a bad scene when they saw one, and this was career-endingly bad. "What are you waiting for?" Miller demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and desperation. "He's the perp! Help me!" "Perp for what, Brad?" O'Connell asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "We need to know what we're walking into. What was the initial call? Do you have a warrant?" The question about the warrant was the final crack in the dam. Miller's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. "It was a tip! Exigent circumstances!" he yelled, repeating the justification that had already failed him. But O'Connell wasn't looking at Miller anymore. He was looking at Marcus Thorne. He saw the man's composure, the way he sat without fidgeting, his gaze steady and assessing. He'd seen that look before, not in criminals, but in soldiers. It was the look of a man who had seen far worse than a loudmouth cop with a gun and was not impressed. The blue line wasn't just hesitating, it was actively refusing to cross over into Miller's mess. They stood in the ruined doorway, a human buffer between Miller's out-of-control aggression and whatever was to come next. They had arrived expecting to back up a brother in blue, but it was becoming terrifyingly clear that their job was now to contain him. As Officers O'Connell and Diaz held their positions in the doorway, creating a fragile stalemate, Marcus Thorne decided it was time to deploy his final piece of personal identification. He had remained silent during the exchange, letting Miller's desperation and the other officers' caution speak for themselves. The live stream was capturing their hesitation, a crucial detail that showed Miller was isolated in his misconduct. Now, Thorne needed to reframe not just the situation, but himself. "Officers," Thorne said, his voice calm and clear, addressing O'Connell and Diaz directly, pointedly ignoring Miller. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am the sole resident of this apartment. I have no criminal record." He paused, letting the words settle. "And I am a veteran of the United States Marine Corps." He slowly, deliberately, turned his head toward the wall beside the couch. On it hung a neatly organized shadow box. Inside, against a field of dark blue velvet, were his service medals, a Purple Heart, a Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with a V for valor, and his campaign ribbons from Afghanistan. Beside the box was a framed certificate honoring Sergeant Marcus Thorne for his 10 years of honorable service. The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. In the culture of law enforcement, there are few institutions held in higher regard than the military. It was a shared world of discipline, service, and sacrifice. To discover that the man Miller had been terrorizing and racially profiling was not a perp or a thug, but a decorated combat veteran, fundamentally changed the moral calculus of the situation. It created a visceral, uncomfortable contrast. The unhinged officer with a history of complaints versus the calm, decorated Marine in his own home. O'Connell and Diaz stared at the shadow box. They saw the Purple Heart, a medal that can only be earned through blood. Their posture changed, the last vestiges of suspicion replaced by a dawning sense of respect and shame. Diaz keyed his mic again, his voice now clipped and urgent. "Dispatch, we have a vet here, a decorated vet. We need Sergeant Rostova on scene immediately. Advise her the situation is untenable." The term untenable was a piece of police jargon that meant the situation was foobar, fouled up beyond all recognition. Miller looked at the medals, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear entered his eyes. His entire narrative had been predicated on the idea that Thorne was a criminal, a lesser man on whom he could impose his will. But that shadow box told a different story. It spoke of honor, courage, and a commitment to the country that Miller, with his tarnished badge, was currently disgracing. The power dynamic had now completely inverted. Thorne's service record was a shield more powerful than any legal argument, and a weapon more damaging than any complaint. On the live stream, which now had over 150,000 concurrent viewers, the revelation sent a new shockwave through the audience. A Marine? They're doing this to a Purple Heart recipient? This officer is a disgrace to the uniform. The story was no longer just about police misconduct and racial profiling. It was now about disrespect to a veteran, a narrative that cuts across political divides and resonates deeply in the American psyche. The digital tide of outrage was becoming a tsunami. Thorne finally lowered his hands from his head, placing them on his knees. It was a small gesture of autonomy, but in the context of the standoff, it was a declaration. He was no longer taking orders. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of his newfound authority, "you have dishonored yourself and your badge. You have broken your oath, and you have done it in the home of a man who fought for the very freedoms you are now trying to strip away." He stood up slowly, not in aggression, but in defiance. He was no longer the suspect, he was the accuser, and the entire world was his jury. The sirens that had been a chaotic chorus now coalesced into the distinct, authoritative chirp of a supervisor's vehicle. A black and white Ford Explorer pulled up, and Sergeant Ava Rostova stepped out. She was a 20-year veteran of the force, a woman who had seen everything the city had to throw at her and had earned her stripes through competence and an almost legendary intolerance for stupidity. She was 45, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a demeanor that radiated calm, no-nonsense authority. As she walked toward the building, she was already getting a garbled version of events from her radio and a flood of text messages from the precinct captain, who was watching the PR disaster unfold on his own computer. When Rostova reached the third-floor hallway, she took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. The media hadn't arrived yet, but the hallway was crowded with a half-dozen uniformed officers, including O'Connell and Diaz, who all stood with a tangible sense of unease. They parted for her like the Red Sea. Her eyes fell on the ruined doorway of 3B, a physical manifestation of a catastrophic failure in procedure. Then she stepped inside. The tableau was just as her officers had described. She saw Calloway, looking like he was about to be physically ill. She saw Miller, still stubbornly holding his ground, his weapon now lowered but not holstered, his face a mask of defiance. And she saw Marcus Thorne, standing tall and composed in the middle of his living room. Her gaze flickered to the shadow box on the wall, noting the Purple Heart first. Her expression, already grim, hardened into something akin to stone. "Miller, holster your weapon, now," she commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a core of steel that demanded immediate compliance. It was the kind of voice that cut through adrenaline and panic. For a moment, Miller seemed to consider defying her. His hand tightened on his Glock. He opened his mouth to protest, to try and sell his version of the story one last time. "That was not a suggestion, officer," Rostova said, her eyes narrowing. "Holster your weapon, or I will have you removed from this scene in handcuffs for insubordination." The threat was real, and they all knew it. Miller's shoulders slumped in defeat. With a final, hateful glare at Thorne, he slid the pistol into its holster. The immediate lethal threat in the room was finally neutralized. The sound of the click as the weapon locked into place was deafeningly loud. Rostova then turned her attention to Marcus Thorne. She did not approach him as a suspect, but with a guarded professionalism. "Sir, my name is Sergeant Rostova. I am the shift supervisor. Are you injured?" "I am not," Thorne replied, his voice even. "I understand you are the resident here, Mr. Thorne, Marcus Thorne." "Mr. Thorne," Rostova said, her eyes briefly meeting his. In that glance, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, two professionals recognizing the gravity of the situation. "On behalf of the department, I apologize for this intrusion. We are going to conduct a full investigation into what happened here." It was a pro forma apology, but coming from her, it carried weight. She then turned to Miller and Calloway, her voice dropping to an icy, clinical tone. "You two, out. Into the hallway. Do not speak to each other. Do not speak to anyone. You will wait for my instructions. Am I clear?" Miller, stripped of his authority and bravado, could only nod mutely. He and a visibly relieved Calloway exited the apartment, their departure observed by the other officers with a mixture of pity and contempt. Rostova now stood alone with Thorne in his violated home. She was no longer just a police sergeant, she was a crisis manager. Her job was to assess the damage, but she already knew, just by looking at the calm fury in Thorne's eyes and the glowing blue light of the camera on the wall, that the damage was incalculable. The invasion was over, but the fallout was just beginning, and she was standing at ground zero. With Miller and Calloway exiled to the hallway, Sergeant Rostova turned her full attention to deconstructing the incident. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted from one of tense confrontation to a quasi-internal investigation. The blue light of the camera served as a constant reminder that this was not a private debriefing. It was a public record. "Mr. Thorne, I need to understand the sequence of events from your perspective," Rostova began, pulling a small notebook and pen from her vest pocket. Her approach was methodical, her tone betraying no emotion. "My officers made entry. Did they announce themselves?" "Negative, Sergeant," Thorne replied, matching her clinical tone. "The first and only announcement was the sound of a battering ram breaking my door. They entered with weapons drawn and issued commands only after they were already inside." Rostova jotted this down. "They did not present a warrant?" "They did not. When I questioned him, Officer Miller claimed he had exigent circumstances based on an anonymous tip regarding narcotics distribution." "Did he specify the address in that tip?" "He did," Thorne confirmed. "He stated the tip was for the apartment on the 3rd floor to the left of the stairs. As I informed him, that would be apartment 3A. This is 3B. Every answer was another nail in Miller's professional coffin. Rostova's face remained impassive, but the steady motion of her pen was documenting a career-ending cascade of failures. She already knew the answers, having heard snippets on the radio and pieced together the rest from the scene, but she needed to hear it from Thorne for the record, for the camera. She keyed her radio, switching to a private channel connected directly to the precinct's records division. "This is Sergeant Rostova. I need the original dispatch log for an anonymous narcotics tip this morning, possibly related to Thorne's address. Find it. Read it to me. Now." She put the radio on speakerphone, holding it out so Thorne could hear as well. A few moments of static passed, then the tinny voice of a records clerk came through. "Got it, Sergeant. Tip came in at 0940 hours. Male caller. Refused to identify. Stated a dealer known as Smiley was running heroin out of an apartment at this address. Caller said, and I quote, 'He's on the 3rd floor. I think it's the one with the busted screen on the window.'" Rostova's eyes immediately went to Thorne's window. The screen was perfectly intact. She then looked at Thorne, a silent question in her eyes. "The screen on 3A's window has been torn for about a month," Thorne offered quietly. "Mr. Henderson complains about the pigeons getting on his sill." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Miller hadn't just misinterpreted left of the stair, he had ignored a key piece of verifiable physical evidence, the busted screen, that would have directed him to the correct, though still likely unwarranted, apartment. He had been so blinded by his gut feeling, so eager for a high-profile drug bust, that he had ignored the most basic tenets of police work: observation and verification. His justification was not just sand, it was a mirage. "Thank you," Rostova said into the radio, cutting the connection. She looked around the wrecked doorway, at the composed veteran, at the camera silently recording it all. She had the full anatomy of the mistake laid bare before her. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a willful dereliction of duty, born of arrogance and fueled by prejudice. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was about to admit, "it is clear my officer acted without probable cause, without a warrant, and without basic diligence. His actions were not in accordance with department policy, or, frankly, the Constitution. The department will take this with the utmost seriousness." As she spoke, a new sound began to filter up from the street, not sirens, but the indistinct clamor of a crowd and the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades in the distance. The media had arrived. The internal investigation was about to become a very public spectacle. Rostova knew that her meticulous note-taking and calm procedure were now less about internal discipline and more about damage control for the storm that was about to break over her entire department. The distant sound of the helicopter grew from a rhythmic beat into a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very windows of the apartment building. It was a news chopper, circling like a vulture over the scene. On the ground, the situation had escalated from a neighborhood curiosity into a full-blown media event. The first news van to arrive from a local affiliate was quickly followed by 3 more. Satellite trucks extended their masts into the sky. Reporters with microphones bearing the logos of every major news network were pushing against the hastily erected police tape, shouting questions at any officer who came near. The viral live stream had done its work. It had acted as a digital beacon, and now the traditional media, drawn by the scent of a major story, had descended in force. The hallway outside apartment 3B, already crowded with police, became a choke point of chaos. A cameraman from a national network managed to slip past the officer guarding the stairwell, his lens capturing the image of the splintered door before he was physically pushed back. The siege was no longer just digital. It was physical. Inside, Sergeant Rostova heard the commotion and knew her window for quiet containment was closed. "Mr. Thorne, the press is here," she stated, the observation heavy with implication. "They will want a statement. I would advise you not to speak with them until you have consulted with legal counsel." As if on cue, Thorne's phone, still sitting on the kitchen table, began to buzz insistently. He walked over and picked it up. The caller ID read, Maya. He answered, putting it on speaker. "Marcus, are you okay? I've been watching everything. I am horrified." His sister's voice came through, filled with a mixture of relief and professional fury. "I've got a local attorney on his way to you right now. His name is Ben Carter. He's former JAG, best in the city. Do not say a word to anyone until he gets there. The entire world is watching. We have all the leverage." "I'm all right, Maya, I understand," Thorne replied, his voice a calming balm on her frayed nerves. "I'll wait for Mr. Carter." The arrival of the media created a new problem for Rostova. Her primary concern had shifted from investigating the scene to securing it and extracting her officers, specifically Miller, without creating a further spectacle. Miller was a visual liability. His face, now synonymous with the viral video, would be a magnet for every camera. Taking him out the front door would be a feeding frenzy. She got on her radio. "All units, establish a hard perimeter. No media past the outer tape. I want a unit to clear a rear exit. We will be escorting involved officers out the back. And find out who the hell is flying that chopper and tell them to back off. They're compromising the scene." But it was too late to control the narrative. The story was already written, broadcast from Thorne's own living room. The news reporters outside were getting live updates from their newsrooms, which were monitoring the stream. They knew about the wrong address. They knew about the racial slurs. They knew Marcus Thorne was a decorated Marine. They weren't just reporting on a police incident. They were reporting on a constitutional violation with a compelling hero and an undeniable villain. The hallway had become a pressure cooker. Officers were trying to hold back reporters. Residents were peering out of their apartments, their phones held up to record their own small piece of the drama. The siege of cameras was total, a 360-degree panopticon of lenses, all pointed at the consequences of one officer's reckless actions. Rostova knew that every decision she made from this point forward would be scrutinized, analyzed, and broadcast to millions. The department wasn't just investigating a bad raid anymore, it was on trial in the court of public opinion, and the verdict was already coming in. The arrival of a sharp-suited, middle-aged man with a leather briefcase signaled the next phase of the conflict. "Benjamin Carter," he announced to the officers blocking the hall, flashing a bar association card. "I'm counsel for Mr. Thorne, step aside." The officers, relieved to have a new authority figure to defer to, let him pass. Carter entered the apartment, and his eyes quickly took in the scene. The broken door, the calm demeanor of his new client, and the weary resignation on Sergeant Rostova's face. He walked directly to Thorne and shook his hand. "Mr. Thorne, Ben Carter, I've been briefed by your sister. Are you ready to have these men leave your home?" "Long past ready," Thorne replied. Carter nodded, then turned to Rostova. "Sergeant, my client wants your officers off his property, immediately. He will not be answering any more questions today. Any further communication will go through my office. We will be preserving this scene for our own forensic analysis." The shift in language was significant. It was no longer a police matter, it was a civil litigation. Rostova recognized the finality in his tone. The time for on-scene investigation was over. "Understood, counselor," she said. She turned and walked to the doorway. The time had come to extract Miller. It had to be done. She found him in the hallway, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, a sullen, defiant look on his face. Calloway stood a few feet away, looking at the floor, wishing it would swallow him whole. "Miller," Rostova said, her voice devoid of any sympathy, "we're leaving. You will be escorted out the rear entrance of the building. You will go directly to the precinct. You will surrender your weapon and your badge to the desk sergeant. You are on administrative leave, effective immediately. Do you understand me?" "You're suspending me?" Miller sputtered, his voice rising in disbelief. "For doing my job?" "You are being suspended for failing to do your job in every conceivable way," Rostova corrected him, her voice dangerously low. "Now, you can walk out of here with what little dignity you have left, or Officer O'Connell and Officer Diaz can escort you. The choice is yours." The fight finally drained out of Miller. He knew he was beaten. He nodded mutely. Rostova gestured to O'Connell and Diaz, who positioned themselves on either side of Miller, not touching him, but making it clear he was in their custody. They began to walk him down the hallway, away from the ruined door of 3B. It was a walk of shame. The other officers in the hall averted their eyes. The neighbors who had cracked their doors open watched the procession in silence. As they rounded the corner toward the back stairs, a reporter and a cameraman who had managed to get inside the building ambushed them. A bright light flared on, and a microphone was shoved in Miller's face. Officer Miller, do you have any comment on the allegations of racial profiling and illegal entry? Miller flinched back from the light as if struck. O'Connell shoved the reporter back. No comment, get out of the way! They hustled Miller down the stairs, but the image was captured. The disgraced officer, his face pale and caught in the glare, being led away from the scene of his disaster. Back in apartment 3B, Thorne stood with his lawyer, watching the last of the police presence dissipate from his home. The invasion, which had started with the violent crack of a battering ram, was ending with the quiet, decisive click of his new lawyer's briefcase. The immediate threat was gone. The armed intruders had been repelled. But the room was still a wreck. The door was still broken, and the silence that returned was heavy with the weight of the violation that had occurred. The physical battle was over, but the fight for justice had just begun. With the police gone, a semblance of quiet returned to apartment 3B, but the energy of the media swarm outside was palpable. Ben Carter, Thorne's new attorney, was a man who understood that the battle ahead would be fought on two fronts, in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. The latter had to be addressed immediately. Marcus, Carter said, his tone shifting from legal advisor to media strategist. They're not going away. We have an opportunity right now to frame this story in your own words. It's powerful, it's undeniable, and it's coming directly from the source. The chief of police will be holding a press conference within the hour, trying to get ahead of this. We need to set the narrative before he does. Thorne, who valued his privacy above almost all else, was hesitant. The thought of facing a bank of cameras and microphones was antithetical to his nature. But he understood the strategic necessity. The live stream had shown the world what happened. Now he needed to tell them why it mattered. Okay, he said, his voice firm. What do I do? We keep it short, powerful, and factual, Carter instructed. No anger, no speculation, just the facts. Your calm demeanor is your greatest weapon. It has been from the start. Let's not change that now. They walked out of the apartment, leaving the splintered door as a silent backdrop. The moment they appeared in the third-floor hallway, a fresh wave of shouting erupted from the scrum of reporters gathered at the stairwell. Carter raised a hand for silence, and surprisingly, a hush fell over the group. They recognized the moment was at hand. Carter led Thorne down the stairs and out the front entrance of the building, stopping just beyond the police tape. The scene was a chaotic sea of cameras, lights, and outstretched microphones. Thorne blinked in the sudden brightness, but his posture remained ramrod straight, his expression unreadable. Carter stepped forward first. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ben Carter. I am the attorney for Mr. Marcus Thorne. Mr. Thorne will make a brief statement. He will not be taking any questions at this time. He stepped back, and Marcus Thorne was alone in the spotlight. He looked directly into the sea of lenses, his gaze sweeping across them as if addressing each reporter individually. He began to speak, his voice calm and steady, carrying easily over the quiet murmur of the crowd. This morning, he began, officers of this city's police department used a battering ram to break down my door. They entered my home without a warrant, without announcing themselves, and with their weapons drawn. They did this based on an uncorroborated anonymous tip that led them to the wrong address. He paused, letting the stark facts sink in. I was accused of being a drug trafficker. I was threatened. I was subjected to racial slurs. I was held at gunpoint in my own living room. The only reason this situation did not escalate further is because every moment of it was broadcast live for the world to see. He gestured back at the apartment building. The evidence is not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether the rights guaranteed to every citizen by our Constitution are real, or if they are just words on paper, easily discarded by those with a badge and a gun. I served this country for 10 years. I fought overseas to defend those rights. I never imagined I would have to come home and defend them from the very people who have sworn an oath to protect them. He looked directly into the main network camera, his gaze piercing. This is not about me. This is about accountability. It is about ensuring that what happened in my apartment today never happens to anyone else, whether they have a camera or not. Thank you. With that, he stopped speaking. He and Carter turned and walked back into the building, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. His statement was less than 2 minutes long, but it was devastatingly effective. He hadn't just told his story, he had framed it as a battle for the soul of the nation, a fight for the meaning of the Constitution itself. He had seized control of the narrative, and the city's police department was now forced to respond not to a chaotic raid, but to the powerful, measured words of a decorated veteran they had wronged. The impact of Marcus Thorne's statement was immediate and seismic. It aired live on every major news network, and clips of his powerful, concise speech ricocheted across social media, juxtaposed with the most damning moments from his earlier live stream. The narrative was set in stone. A hero veteran had been abused by a rogue, racist cop. The police department was facing a full-blown 5-alarm crisis. At police headquarters, the mood was one of controlled panic. Police Chief Frank Drummond, a portly, balding man just 2 years from retirement, was in his office, the glow of 3 different news channels reflecting off his glasses. His phone was buzzing incessantly with calls from the mayor's office, the city attorney, and the president of the police union. The pressure was immense and converging from all sides. "Get me everything on Miller," Drummond barked at his aide. "I want his entire jacket, every commendation, every complaint, every use of force report, now!" He knew he had to get in front of this. Carter had been right. Drummond's team had already been prepping a press conference, but Thorne's statement had changed the entire game. They could no longer spin this as an unfortunate mistake or a procedural error. They had to address the malice, the racism, and the blatant constitutional violations. An hour later, Chief Drummond stood at a podium in the department's briefing room. The room was packed with the same reporters who had been outside Thorne's apartment. The cameras flashed, creating a strobe effect. Drummond looked exhausted, his face grim. He cleared his throat and began to read from a prepared statement. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice heavy. "Earlier today, an incident occurred involving officers from this department that I and the entire command staff find deeply, deeply disturbing." He went on to give a sanitized version of events, confirming that officers had responded to the incorrect address and that an interaction had occurred with the resident. "The actions I have seen on video," Drummond continued, carefully choosing his words, "do not reflect the training, values, or standards of this police department. Abusing the public's trust is an unforgivable sin for a police officer, and while a full investigation is pending, certain actions require immediate and decisive consequences." He looked up from his notes directly into the cameras. "Effective immediately, Officer Brad Miller has been suspended without pay. I have recommended to the Civilian Oversight Board that termination proceedings begin at once. Officer Calloway has been placed on administrative duty pending the outcome of a full internal affairs investigation." It was a swift and unusually harsh response, a clear signal that the department was cutting Miller loose in an attempt to cauterize the wound. But the reporters were not satisfied. Hands shot up across the room. "Chief!" yelled a reporter from the front row. "Officer Miller has a documented history of excessive force complaints, many of them from minority citizens. Why was he still on the street?" Drummond stiffened. "We take all complaints seriously. Each one was investigated." "Chief!" another reporter shouted over him. "Will you apologize to Mr. Thorne? And will the department be paying for the damage to his home?" "The department will certainly cover all costs for property damage," Drummond said, dodging the first part of the question. "And we are making every effort to reach out to Mr. Thorne to discuss the situation." The press conference was a disaster. Drummond's attempts to control the damage were failing. His carefully worded statements sounded hollow against the raw truth of the video. He was offering procedural solutions to a moral injury. He announced Miller's suspension, but he couldn't suspend the rage and mistrust that the incident had unleashed. The department was in full damage control mode, but they were trying to patch a hole in a dam that had already burst. The video, Thorne's statement, and Miller's own history had created a flood of public anger that no press conference could ever hope to contain. The day after the raid, Ben Carter filed a civil rights lawsuit in federal court. The complaint was a masterclass in legal precision, a 60-page document that read like an indictment. It named Officer Brad Miller, Officer Calloway, the city, and the police department as defendants. The causes of action were numerous and damning. Unlawful entry and search in violation of the Fourth Amendment, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent hiring, training, and supervision on the part of the city. The centerpiece of the lawsuit was the evidence, a link to the complete, unedited 8-hour recording from Thorne's security system, which had continued to record long after the officers left, documenting the arrival of his lawyer and the initial damage assessment. The video was irrefutable. The city attorney's office, tasked with defending the city against lawsuits, reviewed the complaint and the video and immediately understood they had no viable defense. There were no facts in dispute. There were no legal gray areas to exploit. Officer Miller's actions were a textbook case of what not to do. Arguing in front of a jury would be an act of municipal suicide, likely resulting in a massive verdict that would include not just compensatory damages for Thorne, but punitive damages designed to punish the department for its gross negligence. Settlement negotiations began almost immediately. The city's initial offer was a paltry $250,000, a standard opening gambit. Carter, on behalf of Thorne, didn't even bother with a monetary counteroffer. Instead, he came back with a list of non-negotiable demands for systemic reform. Marcus doesn't want just a check, Carter told the city's attorneys in their first meeting. He wants to make sure this never happens again. The money is secondary. The reforms are the entire point. The list was extensive. It demanded a complete overhaul of the department's policy on no-knock warrants, effectively banning them except in confirmed hostage situations. It required that all anonymous tips be independently corroborated by a supervisor before any tactical action could be taken. It mandated a new, robust early warning system to flag officers like Miller who accumulate multiple citizen complaints. And most significantly, it called for the creation of a new, fully funded civilian review board with the power to subpoena and discipline officers, completely independent of the police department and the union. The city balked. The police union called the demands an attack on law enforcement. But the political pressure was overwhelming. Activist groups, galvanized by Thorne's case, were holding daily protests outside City Hall. The national media was camped out, running nightly segments on the story. The mayor, facing a re-election campaign, knew the city's checkbook had to open, and its policies had to change. After 3 weeks of intense negotiation, they reached a historic settlement. The city agreed to pay Marcus Thorne $5 million, one of the largest settlements for a single plaintiff civil rights case in the state's history. But the real victory was the city's agreement to enact the entire slate of reforms. The new policies were officially codified into law by the city council and were publicly named the Thorne Mandates. The lawsuit, born from the splintered wood of one man's door, had become a catalyst for citywide lawmaking. Officer Miller was officially terminated from the force, his certification revoked, making him ineligible to work in law enforcement anywhere in the state. Officer Calloway received a 1-year suspension and was reassigned to a desk job, his testimony against Miller having been a key factor in the internal investigation. The case transformed Marcus Thorne from a victim into a reluctant but powerful agent of change. His quiet, disciplined resistance had done more to reform the city's police force than decades of complaints and protests. Weeks turned into months. The new door to apartment 3B was solid and secure, painted to match the old one perfectly. The interior wall had been patched and repainted, leaving no physical trace of the violent entry. The news crews were gone. The settlement money sat in a trust, largely untouched. On the surface, Marcus Thorne's life had returned to its quiet, orderly rhythm. He still sat at his kitchen table in the morning with his coffee and his books. But the peace he had once cultivated now felt different. It was more fragile, a thin sheet of glass over a chasm he now knew was there. The scars of that morning were not on his body, but on his sense of security, on his faith in the systems meant to protect him. He often found himself replaying the event, not with fear, but with a cold, analytical detachment. He would watch the shadows shift across the floor and remember the moment Miller's weapon had been centered on his chest. The stillness he had projected had been real, a product of his training, but beneath it had been a tightly coiled readiness. He had survived not just because of his cameras, but because his mind had never surrendered. He had refused to be cast in the role of the terrified suspect that Miller's prejudice had written for him. He had remained the protagonist of his own story. The narrative, however, is incomplete without examining the poison that fueled the antagonist. What drove Officer Brad Miller? It was more than a simple mistake or a bad day. His actions were the culmination of a worldview curdled by resentment and a sense of entitlement. He was a man who likely felt the world was changing in ways that left him behind. A man who saw challenges to his authority not as procedural checks, but as personal insults. In Marcus Thorne's calm defiance and intellectual superiority, Miller saw a threat to his own identity. Thorne's blackness was simply the hook on which Miller hung his pre-existing rage. He didn't break down the door of a man, he broke down the door of a symbol, a caricature he had constructed in his own mind. His violence was an attempt to shatter an image that made him feel small. One must consider the alternate paths that morning could have taken. What if Thorne hadn't installed the high-end security system? The incident would have devolved into his word against that of two police officers, a battle he would have almost certainly lost. His story would have been a footnote in a complaint file, dismissed as the rantings of an uncooperative suspect. What if he hadn't been a Marine, with a discipline forged in combat? Had he panicked? Had he shouted? Had he made any sudden moves? Miller's fear and aggression could have easily tipped into lethal violence. He would have become another hashtag, another name chanted in protest, his humanity reduced to a tragic headline. His survival and the subsequent justice was a consequence of a rare confluence of preparedness, character, and sheer luck. The broken door of apartment 3B ultimately became a mirror for the nation, reflecting a fractured and deeply ingrained set of problems. The settlement and the Thorne mandates were not an end, but a beginning. They were proof that accountability is possible, but they also highlighted the terrible truth that for most, it remains out of reach. Rights, the story shows, are not inherent protections. They are ideals that must be relentlessly defended, and proof of their violation often requires the very resources, the cameras, the lawyers, the unshakable composure that the most vulnerable lack. The truest victory was not in the money or the new laws, but in the irrefutable record of the truth, broadcast for all to see. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful force for change is a single, unblinking eye that refuses to look away. What part of Marcus Thorne's response did you find most powerful, and why? Do you believe technology, like live streaming, is becoming our most important tool for ensuring police accountability? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more content that matters.